this slide. This will allow you to see the presentation as well as the speakers during this session. On the bottom of your screen, you will see the WebEx controls. We have muted all attendees for today's presentation. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A feature located on the More Options button at the bottom of your screen. A box will then pop up on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type and submit your question to all of the panelists and press Send to submit. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, time permitting. If your question was not answered, we will follow up after the webcast. If you are experiencing technical difficulties during the presentation, start by clicking F5 or submit a question to the host through the Q&A feature. If you are unable to do that, please email meetings@mossadams.com. The material appearing in this presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as advice of any kind, including, without limitation, legal, accounting, or investment advice. Now, with no further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Jared James and Kim Koch for the speakers for this webcast. Jared, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Deanna. My name is Jared James, and I am a senior manager here at Moss Adams in our risk advisory and compliance practice. Really, my career has been specialized in internal controls and IT, but specifically. Also joined today by Kim Cook, who is a partner in our risk advisory and compliance practice. Kim has been practicing public accounting now for a number of years, and she helps lead our SOC practice at a national level, so we're excited to have her today. Just doing a quick look at the agenda here, we're going to start off by discussing a little bit of the history of SOC 2, kind of set a bit of a background and backdrop here to get our conversation started. We're then going to talk about the new types of SOC examinations, so the summary of changes to the SOC 2 reporting and how that is being affected. Then we're going to dive into lessons learned from some of these changes, some of the things that we have been seeing. And then we're going to round out our conversation with a few tips and things that you can do to improve your SOC 2 report, as well as some of the trends that we have been seeing in the market and looking at SOC reports. So, kick us off here, talking about a little bit of the history of SOC 2. So a SOC 2 report is a type of internal controls report, and these types of reports have been around for over a decade. They've been around for many, many years and have provided users the ability to understand and know the types of controls and activities and processes that a service organization has in place. Prior to April of 2016, the term SOC stood for Service Organization Controls Report. And that'll become a little bit more important here as we get further into the presentation. But you're really adapting to the changing market demands and audit standards. The AICPA, they codified new auditing standards, as well as updating the description criteria, and the SOC 2 trust service criteria as well were updated. As part of all these sweeping changes that the AICPA made, one of those changes was changing that term SOC, was modified to stand for a System and Organization Controls Report rather than a Service Organization Controls Report. And, really kind of talking about why that is really starting with adjusting to market demands. The change from that Service Organization Controls Report nomenclature to System and Organization Controls Reports really opened the door to additional internal controls reports. This was no longer a type of report that would be restricted to a service organization, but really opened the door to allow a broader range of organizations to report on their internal controls. As SOC reporting and internal controls have become more important in the market, the AICPA has seen a large demand for these other types of reports where you might not be deemed a specific service organization, but you might need one of these reports to help satisfy other demands in the market. And really looking at those, there were 2 additional controls reports added since a lot of these changes. The first one is the SOC for cybersecurity, and the second is the SOC for supply chain. So as you can see, these types of reports are very much not specific to a service organization per se, but could be used by a much broader range of organizations to report on internal controls. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. And then one final thing here is that as part of that adjustment to the market demands, the ICPA did update the SOC 2 criteria to better align with the COSO framework. And those of us who are familiar with financial reporting or other are probably very familiar with this framework. And we'll talk a little bit about why they did that later on. And then finally, they did change a little bit of the nomenclature to labeling the new criteria as trust service criteria. All right, so jumping in here, the SOC for cybersecurity is it's a reporting framework through which organizations can communicate relevant and useful information about the effectiveness of their cybersecurity risk management program. Just like a SOC 2 report, this is where a CPA is reporting on information related to your cybersecurity program and controls that are in place. It's really designed to be an entity-wide cybersecurity risk management program and to address that, but it really can be very tailored and nuanced to either a specific business unit, a specific segment or function, or even just a different entity that operates under a general cybersecurity risk management program. And this allows an organization to really address and understand the effectiveness of their cybersecurity program. Another interesting point here is that a SOC for cybersecurity report could be designed around a specific type of data, such as PHI, for example. A SOC for cybersecurity report is not a general use report. It's not meant to be distributed broadly to a wide range of users outside of an organization. It is meant for internal use and for key management executives to know and understand the effectiveness of their cybersecurity program. Now, you might be asking why we're talking about this in a SOC 2 webcast, and really an interesting thing about the SOC for cybersecurity is that it does use the trust service criteria as the baseline for communicating and understanding the internal controls that are in place and how those relate to the trust service criteria. So moving on to the SOC for supply chain, this is the newest addition to the SOC suite of reports. This is a reporting framework which allows organizations to report on the way that they produce, manufacture, distribute goods and services. It really allows them to communicate the effectiveness of their internal controls around those processes to allow vendors, suppliers, or other business partners to really understand how that supply chain vendor is mitigating risks associated with providing their goods or services. Certainly in our ever-growing, more specialized world of organizations, what we're seeing is that the risk associated with supply chain and vendor management has increased dramatically. And to respond to that, the ICPA has recognized that and introduced this new report to allow people to really understand within their supply chain where are the greatest risks that they have. Where do they need to really focus their attention, and really understanding what their vendors or suppliers or business partners, how they really are addressing some of the risks related to internal controls and IT and cybersecurity. So there's really 5 things that the SOC for supply chain aims to do in terms of objectives. The first is establishing a common set of criteria for disclosures about manufacturing, production, or distribution systems, very similar to what the SOC 2 has done in kind of creating a standard set of criteria that people know and understand and can really evaluate many organizations with a single report. That's really what this is aimed to do. It's also meant to create a common set of criteria for assessing control effectiveness and design. Third, really helping to reduce the required communication between organizations related to information about their manufacturing, production, or distribution system. And really, hopefully, this will help reduce any major questionnaires that a company might receive or be required to fill out. Might be able to provide a SOC for supply chain report in lieu of having to complete one of those, or just other types of information requests that might arise. Fourth, they're also meant to provide a standard for communicating relevant information without being required to disclose trade secrets, patents, or other intellectual property. This is a big one. It really does help provide a very common framework that allows you to report on internal controls without having to disclose some of those more, sensitive type information. And then fifth and last is really maintaining a standard for organizations when comparing various vendors or suppliers. SOC for supply chain really does kind of help set that baseline and create a measuring stick when you are looking at different organizations, understanding where your risks might lie. It helps you really compare apples to apples instead of one-off security questionnaires or other type of information gathering that may be incomplete or really not relevant for what you are looking for. As opposed to the SOC for cybersecurity, the SOC for supply chain, it is meant for distribution outside of an organization. Obviously, you can provide this to those organizations that are asking for it that you might be a vendor or supplier for. All right. So now we're going to go ahead and dive into some of the SOC 2 changes specifically. And we want to kind of start this conversation by why make these changes? Why did the ICAPA adopt some of these new things, and what was their aim? And really, the answer is quite simple. SOC 2 reporting has become a very big indicator for many organizations when they are looking at using a potential vendor, or if they are using a vendor or service organization, to really understand how those internal controls are functioning and whether or not their services are being provided in a safe and secure way. So these changes were really meant to enhance the SOC 2 reporting and adapt to those market changes that we were discussing earlier. They're really meant to streamline the criteria and really reduce some of the presentation redundancies. If any of you have read the SOC 2 report prior to some of these changes, one thing that stands out very quickly is that many controls would be repeated many times throughout the report in order to gain coverage over those criteria that were set. So really meant to streamline and kind of consolidate those so that it made it a little bit easier and more digestible for a user of the report to know and understand what are the key controls in place and how are those operating. Big one also was that it integrated the 2013 COSO framework, and really aligning that does create a bit of understanding across multiple frameworks of knowing how the SOC 2 and the COSO framework align and how those internal controls are not only meeting the SOC 2 criteria, but also the COSO framework for financial reporting and other types of internal controls. Another thing is really facilitating greater coverage over IT governance, cybersecurity. If you look at the new trust service criteria, you'll see that there is a much greater focus on governance and how that is handled at an organization and how they effectuate that. And then finally, it does also expand links to other IT reporting frameworks that can be reported on in the SOC 2. So with that, we kind of want to dive into, what are some of these changes that we've kind of been discussing along the way, but to really kind of sum them up for you here. The trust service principles were renamed as the trust service criteria. So not a huge change there, but just something to kind of be aware of, that the nomenclature is a little bit different. As we just mentioned, one of the biggest changes was that the trust service criteria was aligned with the 17 principles under the COSO 2013 framework. And along with that, not only was it aligned with COSO, but similar to the COSO framework, the SOC 2 framework did add points of focus for all of the trust service criteria. And this was a really big benefit, I think, for a lot of organizations to really know and understand how to interpret the criteria. If you've ever sat down and just read through the actual criteria, it's a little bit broad. You might have a lot of questions coming away with, well, what exactly does that criteria mean, and really how should this be interpreted? And those points of focus that were added were really meant to add clarity to that, and something that was a big benefit. Trust service categories are still the same. We still have security, availability, processing integrity, privacy, and confidentiality. They are referred to as categories now versus principles before. And then finally, the SOC 2 guide did introduce a new system description criteria and some additional reporting appendices to that process. And with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Kim Cook, who's going to walk us through some lessons learned.
Great. Thanks, Jared. Yeah. Now that we've kind of went to the history of the SOC 2 and refreshed our memories on what changed with the trust services criteria, we thought it'd be a good idea to talk about what did we learn from these changes. So probably 1 to 2 years ago, you made these changes to your SOC 2, but at that time, we were just using best judgment of what some of these changes in the criteria meant and some of the changes to the system description. And now that we have, the last 18 or 24 months of seeing what other SOC reports are in the marketplace and what others have done, it's a good time to take a close look at your current SOC 2 controls and report and determine if there's some other changes that you should be implementing or updating. So I'm going to start at a high level. One of the things that changed with the new trust services criteria was the system description was expanded for a very specific section on service commitments and system requirements. And for a lot of organizations, it was kind of hard to come up with what should we put here? How detailed should we be? Sometimes I know we gave a lot of our clients some examples, but they were pretty high level and they weren't tailored to every organization. So I encourage SOC 2 reports, if you have a SOC 2 report, to go and relook at this section and really make sure you tailored it for your organization. Is it comprehensive? Does it really discuss your service commitments? And maybe even compare it to some other SOC 2 reports in the marketplace to see if you're on track, or ask your auditors or Moss Adams of how that can be improved. Also, when you implemented the new SOC 2 criteria, likely you took your previous SOC 2 controls and you mapped them to the new criteria. And some of the new criteria were pretty high level and not necessarily specific, so it's kind of hard to tell which control should go where and how many times you should review the control. Some examples are risk assessment. There's a lot of criteria that talk about risk, and so the risk assessment control might have been mapped to 10 or 12 different places. Another example, penetration testing. It's just a control that seems to fit with a lot of the criteria, so I've seen where it's reused several times. And now that we've had a year or two of these new criteria, it's a good time to look back and think, how does my mapping look? Are there some refinements I can do to really focus on the controls that are most key to each criteria? This will focus the report and also reduce the length, because as you know, these are big reports to read and a lot of pages, and the more refined they can be, the better. There's also a few instances where controls that maybe were in your historic SOC 2 report, you decided you wanted to move them to the new criteria, but if you really take a close look, they don't really fit with the criteria and they're not key. So there might be the opportunity to reduce a handful of controls. Another big change was related to the description, and there's a requirement now that security incidents should be disclosed. The thing here is we actually haven't seen a lot of changes in SOC reports and the narratives related to this, but if your auditor should be asking about this, and there should be an evaluation process of really determining would this incident require disclosure? So as you're thinking back through the year or even forward, thinking as security incidents pop up, also be going through that thought process of, why or why not should this be included in our SOC 2 narrative? Next, I'm going to dive into some specific areas related to the criteria and what we've seen. One of them is related to entity level controls. And actually, this is the first criteria. CC 1.1 talks about integrity and ethical values. And I think this was easy for people to dive in and start moving right into security controls. But a good thing here is to really think about how do you communicate integrity and ethical values to your employees. And often this is through the code of conduct or other means like that. And it's something they might review well during the onboarding process. So that's a key to make sure you're including there. The next change that was really big was related to board and management oversight. And this is specifically criteria 1.2. And I think this threw off a lot of organizations who are smaller and didn't have an independent board of directors. And what we've seen is the way many organizations implemented this was right on track. So if you have a board of directors, it's great to have a control here about your communication with them regarding security and control deficiencies. But if you didn't have a board and you instead had a control related to executive management, that works just fine. And so, the key here is really making sure you're having those conversations with the highest level of management and that they are updated on your security posture and any issues. Another area that was a bit different with the new criteria was in the risk assessment section. There was a criteria that specifically mentioned fraud. And I think this threw a lot of people off of trying to decide, well, what should we do with fraud? I usually think of fraud as being financial statement related, either related to cooking the books or misappropriation of assets. And if that's where you went with your SOC 2 controls here, you'll want to relook at those and really thinking about fraud as it relates to the system. Think about threats and vulnerabilities to the scope of the system, and that's where the fraud focus should be. Some common controls are thinking about fraud as it relates to the system in your risk assessment process or in your management reporting process. Vendor management was another area that got emphasized in the new SOC 2 criteria. This is in CC 9.0 series. And if you only have controls here about evaluating your subservice organizations and reviewing the SOC report from those subservice organizations, that's a good indicator. You probably want to work on expanding the controls for this criteria. Really think through your vendor management process as it relates to vendors that are integrated with the system or part of the system, having good controls over assessing new vendors, and then a control about annually relooking at that assessment and making sure it's still appropriate. The last item I wanted to emphasize related to a specific criteria was related to security incidents. In the system operations section, which is the CC 7.0 series, there's several specific criteria related to security incidents. And what I see is a lot of clients using just general incidents as the controls for this area. Things like where a customer submits a help desk ticket for something small that needs to be fixed. But really what we want to see here is that you have a security incident response plan and that you have a robust process for handling those security incidents throughout the full life cycle of the incident, from identification to communication to recovery and making sure it doesn't happen again. So really take a look at those controls and see if more can be done to expand those. Next, I just want to go through some general ideas on encouraging people to improve their SOC 2 report. It's easy to think you've made it through the SOC 2 process for several years, and now you can just continue with making small updates to your narrative or internal control set. But I really encourage organizations to take a close look at their SOC 2 report every year, especially if your organization's been changing. Some signs that you probably need to refresh your narrative or your control set is how much has your organization changed since you first implemented the SOC 2? Were you pretty much a startup with just a few customers and now you have several hundreds of employees? Have you been changing the technologies used? Or do you have more manual, more automated processes than you did in the past? And, also just asking for feedback. I know we're always happy to give clients ideas of how to really make sure their controls are best practices. So this is something that can be done during the planning phase each year, just to make sure you're really keeping the controls at the top of your game. Another thing to do is really look at the system description. Sometimes, especially if you're the one writing the description, it's really easy to get in the details because you know everything about the system. But taking a step back, maybe even having some other users or other people in your organization read through the description and think through, does it make sense to a user who doesn't know our day-to-day operations? You want to make sure that the user can really understand the scope of your system, the components that are in scope, but at the same time, you don't need to go overboard with so many details that it gets really complicated. So that's a good way to refresh your SOC 2 report. And along with that is the control wording. I know I talked about reviewing your controls and making sure you keep those updated for current practices, but another thing is just looking at the wording and making sure they're clear. Are they too wordy? Is it hard to understand what you're really doing here unless you're the actual person performing the control? It's great to make some control wording updates to be clear and concise. I always like to think of it that you want to take your SOC report and really think of it through the lens of the user, and do they understand what you're trying to convey to them? Lastly, we just want to touch on some trends related to the SOC 2 report. The good news is we don't see anything on the horizon where the AICPA is making big changes to the criteria like they did a couple of years ago. Right now, they seem to be focusing on more providing clarification for these criteria that now have been in place for a couple of years. So that's good news that there's not big things you need to be worried about there. Other things we've seen is an increased demand for SOC 2 reports. So if you're an organization where you're kind of trying to decide, should we move forward with a SOC 2 report, I suggest getting ready, having a readiness assessment done and making sure you have the right controls in place. We're seeing organizations having to have a SOC 2 report earlier and earlier in their life cycle, sometimes before even the first customer is onboarded. Another thing we're seeing is that users like to know that you have other frameworks in place depending on your type of organization. Some examples are HIPAA, HITRUST, PCI, ISO. And so the SOC 2 report can be used to help convey that. You can always include an unaudited section in your SOC 2 report, and you can map your SOC 2 controls to these other frameworks. And so it provides the user with a very good understanding of how close you are to, in addition to having a SOC 2 set of controls, but also another set of controls like HITRUST or HIPAA. We're seeing an uptick in the confidentiality and privacy categories. Security and availability have always been really big, and confidentiality was probably the third. But as more and more users really become interested in information being kept confidential and private, these categories are definitely increasing in use. So keep that on your radar if you have a SOC report that doesn't include these, but you do have that type of information in scope. The last item is related to change management. We've seen a lot of companies, especially in the software as a service sector, where change management controls are kind of the key important controls along with logical access in your SOC 2 report. And a lot of these processes are becoming more and more automated. So that'd be a key that you probably need to relook at the controls and make sure they really reflect your processes. But the other area is we've also seen a lot more qualified opinions related to segregation of duties. So you really want to make sure you have a set of controls that shows that your developers cannot make changes to production and that is properly segregated. So just a thing there to double check or keep in mind. And that's all I have for today related to things to think about as you're updating your SOC 2 controls, as well as just what's coming up when it comes to SOC 2 report. I appreciate all of your time and attention, and Jared and I will definitely go through any questions that are submitted and get back to you individually on those questions. Thank you.